Dr. Nicole Bush is the Lisa and John Pritzker Distinguished Professor of Developmental and Behavioral Health at UCSF, jointly appointed in the Departments of Pediatrics and of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences, and is the Division Chief of the Division of Developmental Medicine. She is also a Senior Fellow at the Harvard Center for the Developing Child and a leader in the NIH ECHO National Children's Health Study Consortium. A licensed clinical psychologist with postdoctoral training in stress biology, pediatrics, and epidemiology, Dr. Bush leverages her cross-field training to innovatively bridge disciplines. She is an international expert in social drivers of health and well-being, with deep expertise in early childhood trauma, resilient science, and the importance of community engagement and culturally responsive approaches. Dr. Bush's presentation will draw from her research on early childhood adversity and evidence-based interventions that can reverse the biological and psychological impacts of trauma across the life course. Dr. Bush's work aims to advance prevention efforts, identify protective factors, and discover how to promote resilience through supporting existing strengths, providing family and community-level interventions, and shaping public policies to enable thriving across all communities and across all generations. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bush to the stage.
What an incredible honor to be here today with all of you. And in particular, thank you to this family. I had the joy of meeting some of you last night, and I called my family. I have 2 sons myself, and I told my husband in a way that kind of unsettled him, I hope that when our kids are in their 30s and 40s, that they bring all their friends together to do something really amazing in honor of my passions. I can't imagine a greater gift than to see my family connect with loved ones in their community in such a way. So thank you. I feel really honored to be here. I brought Linda's card up with me today to the podium just so that she's with us here. It's amazing to be here. Santa Cruz and beautiful. What an incredible place. What an incredible venue. What an important reason to be here today. And I thank you. I'm going to take you on a little bit of a journey. Sometimes I go fast. Sometimes I go slow. There are handouts. Most of the important things I have to share today are all in there. And there's resources you can look up later. One of the really important things about the work that I do is to try to make it accessible. And so I think you'll find lots of ways to learn more about what I talk about today if you're interested. Okay, so let's get going. I'm going to talk about the effects of adversity, but it won't all be bad news. So if you start feeling stressed at the beginning of my talk, hang in there. There's a path towards resilience as we go through. When we think about health, what comes to mind? What are the things that make someone healthy or unhealthy? Think about it for a minute. Beyond their genetics or whatever rare variant someone might have that might contribute to their health, what are the biggest things that drive how we feel? Well, most people are pretty surprised to know that the primary drivers are social factors. More than 50% of the variability in whether or not someone is well or unwell can be explained by social factors, non-genetic, non-medical factors that influence health outcomes. This is things where we're born, where we grow, where we play, where we live, where we work, the communities we live in, how we're treated as individuals or because of our group membership. These factors are very powerful. And in fact, some research suggests that our zip code explains about 50% of the variability in our health. And that's a really powerful statistic. And what's amazing is that the zip code of your childhood is much more powerful than the zip code of your adulthood to predict your adult health. And so one of the goals today is to get us thinking about that and how we can do something with this information. I'm going to tell you today about some of the science about how social factors explain variance in health and disease. How does it get under the skin to affect airway health? How does it get under the skin to affect cardiovascular disease risk? So we're going to talk about that. And it used to be that people didn't understand this at all. We are learning quite a lot more in recent years, but there's a lot of layers I'm going to unpack today. But to get us all on the same page, I just want to make sure that folks are familiar with some of the concepts and terms. So how many folks have heard of ACEs in the audience? Okay, that's my crowd. So adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, is a catchphrase that includes a lot of different things, but it's been popularized a lot the last couple decades, in particular looking at these 10 different domains, although there's many different adversities that are not on this slide that can be considered an ACE. And this includes things such as physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, emotional and physical neglect, or household dysfunction, things such as having a family member who's incarcerated, coming from a divorced family, domestic violence in the home, substance abuse in the home. And one thing that I think is really important to say is that some of the things I'm going to talk about today might be things that folks in this room have experienced. I myself have experienced many of these. My childhood was very complicated. And it doesn't, no one deserves to experience any of these things, and yet it's a reality of our society. And it's actually incredibly common. This slide shows how frequent some of these things are when you, in a survey of 17,000 adults, how many had experienced in their childhood various forms of abuse, neglect, or household dysfunction. Pretty common. In fact, only 1 in 3, or about 33% of Americans have 0 ACEs. And that's just of the 10 that I showed you. Again, there's many other types of adversity that weren't even included in the survey. And 64% have at least one. So this is a common thing that we need to be aware of and understand its impacts. And science has shown repeatedly, when we look at adult health, that having increasing numbers of ACEs in your childhood is associated with a greater risk of health outcomes. And this slide shows a couple of those here, but in part it can lead to health risk behaviors such as sedentary behavior, smoking, alcohol use, drug use, missed work. So those are more like health behaviors. They're not necessarily disease outcomes, but also physical and mental health outcomes like severe obesity, diabetes, depression, risk of harming oneself or completed suicide, heart disease, cancer, stroke, lung function, and even broken bones, risk for accidents and injuries. And there's been a lot of research on this in the last couple decades, and the evidence is really profound, that ACEs have lasting effects on more than 40 different disease and health outcomes, and it includes not just health, but things such as life potential, like graduation rates, academic achievement, and lost time for work. So this is something we really need to be paying attention to, and yet folks in this room are well aware, but I'm going to tell you some of the things I think we need to start spreading the word around to get more people to be paying attention. So I want to take just a second to think, how do you think this is connected to health? How is it that this stuff gets under our skin? Stop and think about some of the major stressful times in your life. What did your body feel like? What was going on under your skin? Did your heart rate elevate? Did you feel your muscles tense? Did you have trouble sleeping? Did you feel like you're all revved up or that you couldn't move? Everybody kind of responds differently. And it's actually our biological response to stress in large part that explains this pathway between adversity and health outcomes. And this picture shows some of the mechanisms by which this can happen. Those less familiar with that, just review for just a moment. When we face significant threats, our body has this incredible evolutionarily adaptive response that helps us stay alive. It helps us flee the saber-toothed tiger or fight the warring tribe that's come in to steal our snacks. And this is an incredibly important response to help us run or fight or protect. And this involves things such as activating the adrenal glands, which can activate hormones like cortisol and adrenaline. This can get into our bloodstream and activate a whole host of variety of physiological responses that help us prepare. And what's really important is that we need this. It's a good response. I think sometimes the stress response gets a bad rap, but it's actually really amazing. It helps me show up and give a talk here with some energy. I'm activated, and it helps me perform also. So it's something that there's very nuanced. It's not always about the saber-toothed tiger. And there's alternative systems and processes that help us relax. Rest and digest is one of the kind of more layperson accessible frameworks that helps us after the threat is gone, recover our body to homeostasis and a sense of calm. It allows us to then digest our food, repair with our immune system, sleep, all those things to tell us that the threat is gone and now you can recover. And that's largely driven by our parasympathetic nervous system, and it's critical for our health. And our bodily physiology is constantly in flux. These systems are integrated and communicating and interdependent and really precious, and we love that they do this for us. However, if our bodily response is activated in a very severe, intense traumatic context, or if it's chronic and unrelenting, and we don't have the chance to rest and recover because the stress is enduring daily, it can lead to the possibility of compensatory action and problems with communication and signaling in our physiology that can kind of break the system. Or maybe the system is still functioning, but it's exhausted. It takes a lot of energy to activate these responses in our bodies. And so this figure highlights some of the ways in which chronic stress or severe traumatic stress can lead to different inflammatory factors that can then contribute to cellular aging. And at the bottom are a couple examples of some of the consequences of accelerated aging: DNA damage, epigenetic changes, shorter telomeres. Telomeres are the caps on the chromosomes at the end of our DNA that help keep it intact, and you don't want them to fray. Like at the end of your shoelace, you want that cap to stay on, otherwise things kind of fall apart. Similarly, the shortened telomeres can lead to other health and aging outcomes that we don't want. And so chronic activation of the stress response without relief can be problematic. And some people have used this visual to think about, like, not all stress is bad. There's positive stress. It helps us make friends. It helps us go on that date we're nervous about and perform in a charming way. And it helps us do work and perform under pressure. It also helps us, maybe grab our kid if they're about to fall in the pool, those kind of things. And then there's tolerable stress, which is a temporary stress response that's more significant. It's not really that desirable, and yet it's tolerable because we have supportive relationships or resources in our environment that helps us buffer that response. And then this is a term I have some issue with. I don't think it's a perfect term because it's a little stigmatizing, but it's really commonly understood in the communities. So toxic stress, which is a type of stress that is unrelenting, and you don't have the buffering context in your environment to help you regulate and get to that rest and digest sensation in your body. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about the science that I engaged in. I graduated from college with a degree in psychology, and I got really interested in working in clinical spaces. I had been doing work in juvenile detention. I had been working in community psychiatry. I ran an outpatient day treatment clinic for chronic mentally ill, dually diagnosis community members, and I loved the work, and it was a real passion for me. And yet, I felt like I kept hearing stories about childhood. I kept hearing stories about the challenges that my patients and clients had faced, and I saw from my own lived experience how powerful that could be on people's well-being. And I got really interested in understanding how this stuff happens earlier in life. And so I went and got my PhD in clinical psychology, did a couple postdocs, really wanted to understand this. And in my postdoc at UC Berkeley, I started working with Tom Boyce, and he taught me about developmental stress biology. And we ran some experiments together, and I am just going to tell you a little bit about them so you have a flavor of how I do this science. I wanted to know, what is it about stress reactivity in kids, and how early can we see this stress getting under the skin? Because when I started this work, we really thought it was an adult thing. So we put kids in these challenges, we have them rest and be calm and watch a soothing movie and listen to a book, and then we make them give like these mini speeches or watch a scary movie of a cartoon dinosaur stress scene, and we do a variety of challenges and cognitive challenges, and we have them put their saliva on a swab, and we test it for this hormone cortisol, which cortisol is really important for a lot of things. It's not just a stress hormone. A lot of people talk about it that way, but it helps with digestion and muscle repair, and you have a cortisol awakening response that helps you wake up with energy, and then a cortisol wanes over the day to help you calm and rest and go to sleep. Cortisol is really critical. And what we found in our science is that even in 5-year-olds, that greater levels of family adversity or poverty in the home predicted higher levels of cortisol throughout the day. those kids were less likely to have that decline over day that helps them rest and digest and repair an immune system function. And we saw this in early kindergarten. And at the time we published this wasn't really understood or known. And so I started on this path and wondering, well, can we see it in other systems? We hooked those same children up to EKGs. We got sympathetic nervous system, parasympathetic nervous system activity on these children. And we found that family level subjective, and objective, so what's your family's income, what's their education level, but also, you might have $100,000, but in your community, and given your debts and your families and the complexities of your family's resource needs, are you doing better or worse off than other people in your community? And so that subjective and objective perception of enough resource really predicted whether or not these 5-year-olds had fight or flight responses that were highly reactive and could recover after a stressor, and that was really powerful. And we found that it predicted changes over the kindergarten year, so not just a single time point, but whether or not it affected their developmental trajectories. And I followed those kids to age 9 and found, using cheek swabs on the inside of their cheeks that we assayed later for DNA methylation. And your DNA is stable, it doesn't change over time, but methylation is these marks on the DNA that can affect whether or not a gene is turned on or off and processes proteins and leads to behaviors and wellness and metabolism and all these different things. And so we found this difference that was predicted by family income, family education, and family adversity at age 9, whether or not certain genes were turned on and off. And the genes that it was associated with were really linked to the immune system function and health and mental health outcomes. So across these range of studies in early childhood, we found a range of family and social adversities were predictive of functioning in young children across a range of biological systems. And so I was really compelled to continue this work, and we dug even earlier. Well, can we see it in toddlers? Can we see it in 3-year-olds? And this is a complicated slide, but I share this study with you all because these systems don't operate in isolation. Your sympathetic nervous system is not in a little box on the corner that just gets taken out in times of stress. It's interacting with all the other systems constantly to help us sleep, walk, talk, eat, et cetera, go to the bathroom. And so we used complicated statistical modeling to look at all the data we had on these 5- and 6-year-old children together and look at profiles. Were there some kids who were high in all of them, low in all of them, high just in cortisol, but not in the autonomic outcomes? And what we found was that for children who experience a lot of adversity between birth and 18 months, they were much more likely to show up at the clinic and after all of our experiments to be a child who had high anticipatory arousal across systems. So they would show up at the laboratory before we even did anything complicated with them, and they were just anxious and hypervigilant and aroused, and they didn't recover even when we did the calming activities with them. And more importantly, we tested their executive functioning. We do these tasks, for those who are less familiar with executive functioning, we do tasks to see, do you have working memory capacity? Can you hold the rules of one thing, shift focus in the middle of a task if we change the rules on you? If we tell you, please put this card with the green pig in the box by color, and they sort it in the green rabbit, and then we say, okay, now we're gonna change by shape, now put it by shape, can they shift? Or do they see green and keep doing it? And you can do developmental challenges as the kids age to figure out their capacity to do this. And executive function is really powerful. It's a strong predictor of behavioral dysregulation, academic functioning. You can imagine your ability to sit still, listen, attention, and shift gears. And what we found is for those kids who had that trajectory of that anticipatory arousal, they performed much more poorly on the executive function tasks. And just last month, I completed a review. I looked at 75 years of data in children and over 150 meta-analyses, other review papers, and a couple single studies. And we reported on the overall incredibly compelling evidence for early life social adversity's effects across a range of outcomes. Prior to this review we published last month, most people were focused on single domains. So some people just study mental health. Some people just study cardiovascular health. But my goal was to really say, hey, these biological systems that we're seeing that are affected by adversity, innervate almost all of our organs and systems. And we need to understand how pervasive these effects are across a bunch of different outcomes that are important for society. And indeed, we found that early life stress in a range of forms, often operating through family health, have strong relationships with child health before adulthood. So those ACEs slides I showed you earlier were really focused on adult health outcomes. This review demonstrates how important it is for all these different things. And then we also reviewed the literature on mechanisms. And as I gave you some highlight reels of some of my specific studies, the review looking across the literature available show that there's differences in brain structure and function, inflammatory processes, HPA axis function, ANS function, epigenetic processes, gene expression, biological aging, and pubertal timing. So adversity, it contributes to accelerated pubertal onset and development, rapid development, which can be a stressor and problematic for some. But I want to pause, because it's important that people understand those linkages, and yet adversity is not deterministic. We know there's huge variability in the types of responses that individuals have to adversity. And one of my mentors, Tom Boyce, I mentioned earlier, a fabulous human, was really interested in this individual difference, and he coined this concept, biological sensitivity to context. And he wrote a book, and I have it highlighted here on the right for those of you guys who like to read. It's a beautiful book, The Orchid and the Dandelion. And he talked about how some children are much more sensitive to context, much more responsive and reactive to environmental input than others. So in a highly stressful environment, they're much more likely to have worse adaptation, whereas in a really optimized environment, they're more likely to have the best adaptation. So that's sort of a for better or worse scenario. And then children with low biological susceptibility or sensitivity, things might get hard, but they tend to kind of stay rather stable. And the orchid and dandelion hypothesis, if you've ever tried to grow orchids, they need like the perfect humidity, the perfect sunlight, not too much water, and not too much sun, and not too hot, and not too cold. And if you get it right, they are stunning, right? Versus a dandelion, like you can try to pick it, you can mow it, and it's like, hello, and it just keeps coming back, right? And so some people don't love that analogy because, we're talking about humans and kids, but I think it's really helpful for some people to hear that. And it depends on the context and the system and the kid. And someone might be a dandelion in one setting and an orchid in another, so it's not like a person is a dandelion, but it's a good analogy to help explain some of the next things we found in the review, which is up here on the left. There's child factors, like individual differences in reactivity and regulation that really predict whether or not the adversity will have this impact on the body and later health outcomes. But then also these whole range of family factors, school and childcare factors, and neighborhood factors that also predict variability in whether or not these event exposures lead to problematic outcomes. So again, this review is in the end. I'll show some citations for all of that. But this is why ACEs, or adversity more broadly, are very predictive at the level of the population. Like if I did a sampling of everyone in here and I looked at your adversity history and your health outcomes, we'd do a pretty good job of predicting at a population level what the averages are. But I can't tell you any one person who tells me, oh, if I have 4 ACEs, oh, well, I know for sure you have cardiovascular disease. It doesn't work like that, because there's so much heterogeneity, there's so much variability, and it's really important that we remember this as clinicians, as individuals, as people who have been exposed to lots of adversity, that it's not our destiny. And so I guess I like to stop and say, well, is this a surprise? Was anything I shared surprised anyone? Right? One of the most frustrating things about being a scientist is when I started publishing this, clinicians especially, they're like, well, I could have told you that. I know I was a clinician too, but nobody believed me when I was like, I think this child that I'm working with in South and West Chicago, they've got crime outside their homes, they've got family challenges, they are experiencing poverty, they're, all this violence around them. I feel like their body has changed. I feel like their physiology has changed. And someone was like, sure. But I couldn't show it with data, and that was one of the many factors that drove my career. And so it may not surprise you, and yet it wasn't commonly known and is still not popularly understood in our society, and that's one of my goals of being here with you today. So that's pretty well understood. But what's less well understood is that this process actually begins in utero. a little more novel maybe for some of you. And that's what I'm going to spend the next few minutes telling you about. So in 2010, the cover of Time magazine started talking about this. And similarly, I had just started getting really interested in this and was kind of bummed Time magazine scooped me on it. Thought I was really onto something. There is a theory called developmental origins of health and disease, which has now been supported by a whole range of experiments and observational evidence, that the intrauterine environment provides important information about stress, nutrition, taste, toxins to the developing fetus. And you want to think about why, right? Any baby being gestated could be born anywhere in the world. And to optimize its survival, that fetus needs signals from maternal biology to tell it, am I being born into a very hot place where I'm going to need to be able to perspire and stay cool? Am I being born into a place with almost no nutrition, so I need to hoard calories? Am I being born in a place where there's a lot of stress and I need to come out ready with a very robust fight or flight system? Or, can I use some of that energy instead of building those particular things to optimize cognitive function and the pleasure of thinking deeply? And so there's opportunity costs that the maternal-fetal communication are doing constantly to figure out how can I optimize this baby's chance of survival in the world that it's born into, and not just survival in the short run, but to procreation, because that's evolution's goal, right, to get us to procreate so that we can pass on our genes. And so this theory really talked about chronic disease can arise when there's a mismatch between the world the baby was programmed for in utero and the real world. One example that I think people understand quickly is if a fetus is developed in a context where it understands there's very low nutrition in the world and it develops to hoard calories, but it's born into a world with a lot of calories, a lot of fast food, processed food, and they end up eating a lot of that, they're much more likely to develop obesity. Or when a short-term survival tactic, like come out with that fight or flight system really strong, is really adaptive to help it get to procreation stage, which is really, early adolescence. But it's not adaptive to get you through age 40, 50. You might have heart disease, cancer, et cetera. So it might be something that's adaptive in the short run, but problematic over aging. And we live longer now, right? So some of these strategies aren't so great in a population that ages. So for folks who are interested in this, there's a great review that was written by Catherine Monk 6 years ago. It's a little out of date now, but it outlines some of these ideas. How does interpersonal and intrapersonal and socio-environmental stresses in maternal exposures, in her experience, how do those operate to affect child behavior and psychopathology risk? And what are some of the possible mechanisms by which that's occurring in utero? And again, this has been 6 years and the field is really burgeoning, so there's a lot more out there since then. But another really important part to keep in mind is that there's vast variability in the types of chronic stress that individuals and communities face, and those from marginalized and socially dispossessed communities are much more likely to experience many more of them and many unique ones, and some of them are highlighted here. For example, whether or not they experience direct discrimination and prejudice, exposure to hate crimes, racially motivated violence, or experience things related to structural racism that ensures they live in a neighborhood that's higher in crime, has less green space, less job opportunities, less mentoring, and more just negative context. And it's really important that we think about all of this when we're trying to understand these systems in which health develops. And so with that framework, I started a study called the SEED study long ago, trying to see what I could unpack here, what I could learn about this and share. And we enrolled, I'm going to go back here. We enrolled 180 families in the Bay Area. And this is mostly in the East Bay, so for those who know, Richmond, Oakland, Berkeley. And predominantly low-income families, very racially and ethnically diverse. And we asked these women, as they enrolled in second trimester, about their lives, and then after their pregnancy, we asked, how many of these major stressful life events happened to you during your pregnancy? And what we found is there were almost 80% experienced one or more major stressful life event during pregnancy in this high-risk sample, or the sample of families facing a lot of risk factors. And on average, there was almost 3 major types of events. And when I say events, some of these things are enduring events. So if you got separated or divorced, that's a pervasive stressor, right? It's not like a one-time thing, one and done, right? It's a pretty significant stressor that's enduring. And 50% of women in the sample had more than 3. And similar to the child data I showed you, I did a bunch of really cool experiments I don't have time to tell you about, where we hooked kids up to the EKGs in infancy at 6 months. We did these gold standard still face paradigm experiments to understand their stress reactivity and recovery. And we found that mothers who had had a lot more negative major events in pregnancy, their children were much more likely to have increased cardiovascular response to a stressor, in particular pre-ejection period, the sympathetically driven reactivity, and they were less able to recover after stressor. We looked at medical records. They were more likely to have rapid infant weight gain. And lots of people love a cute chubby baby, but rapidly gaining weight during the first year of life is a risk factor for childhood obesity and adult obesity. And what we found is for each additional one type of event during pregnancy that a mom experienced, the baby had a 40% greater odds of having rapid infant weight gain. And when we looked at the medical records, the pediatric records, they were much more likely to have physical illness and all kinds of physical illness, not just one kind, but infectious illnesses, non-infectious illnesses, and more diversity of illnesses. And so again, across objective outcomes, we have an electrocardiogram, weight gain, and illness outcomes. We're seeing stress is linked to these objectively measured problems in kids' health in the first year of life. And so our work provided some of the earliest demonstrations that actually got reviewed in some of the papers I highlighted earlier to demonstrate that in utero, maternal social environment can affect the child's health. But more important than that, I was really thinking, hey, women carry in their bodies experiences and biological changes from our own childhoods. And we carry that forward into our reproductive biology. And so I started wondering, like, well, what if I mashed up my 2 fields? What if I mashed up the ACEs under the skin and prenatal programming? Would we see that there's an additive effect? And so I want to tell you a little bit about the science in that domain. But I needed a bigger sample. So if I'm looking at multiple different sensitive periods of maternal adversity and a range of health outcomes, I need a bigger sample. And so about 10 years ago, I became part of the National Children's Study, the Environmental Influences on Child Health Outcomes, or ECHO, National Consortium, and we have 5 primary outcomes that we're interested in learning about pre, peri, and postnatal, so that's things like birth timing, premature birth, and postnatal depression, but then upper and lower airway outcomes, obesity, neurodevelopment, and positive health. And I, in particular, was the MPI or director, co-director of about 2,000 study participants across 7 different sites in the US, and this highlights that came from 3 different cohorts. And we pooled those data together, and I made sure they all had the same data so we could harmonize them. And working together with some of my colleagues in this ECHO pathway studies, we looked and saw we had data that was overlapping on physical and sexual abuse as well as interpersonal violence in the home for mothers' report of those experiences in her own childhood. And what we found is across those 7 different sites and those 3 cohorts, there was a remarkable similarity in the volume of reporting of maternal ACEs, and that's what these 3 lines are. It shows you the 3 different cohorts, where there was about 60% had no report of that. Remember, this is just 3 items. It's not the big 10-item ACE or a larger scale, but just those 3 items, only 60% had never had any of these 3. And we looked at that in conjunction with that prenatal stressful life event stuff that I was telling you about. And we found that maternal exposure to childhood adversity in her own childhood was associated with the level and rate of rise of a really key hormone during pregnancy that's critical for fetal development and birth timing. It's linked to premature birth, it's linked to maternal depression, and it's linked to infant outcomes. And so mom's history of childhood adversity was predicting this placental corticotropin releasing hormone. We also found that it was related to prenatal and postnatal depression risk in these mothers, as well as infant development and behavior that we looked at age 1. And so mom's own childhood is carrying forward in some manner in a way that's affecting her pregnancy health outcomes and her child health. And when we extended this and looked just specifically at childhood maltreatment, so a broader measure of physical or sexual abuse and neglect in the larger echo study, see all these dots, so the participants in this particular data set I'm telling you about came from all over the country, not just the 7 sites I showed you earlier. We were able to find that mom's trauma experience in her childhood was increasing the odds of internalizing problems, so that's depression, anxiety, those kind of inward symptoms of mental health, increased risk of asthma, autism spectrum disorder, ADHD risk, as well as multimorbidity, or having lots of different problems. And for moms who reported having multiple types of maltreatment, they had children with more problems. And so really showing on this national scale, hey, this is something we need to be paying attention to, and almost no one was talking about it. But we weren't sure, well, is it just that moms with childhood adversity have stressful pregnancies and that's what's happening? Is it just driving through pregnancy? And so we looked, well, what about our samples that have both measures, and can we see if there's like a unique prediction? And so this is a sample of about 2,000 kids at age 4 to 6. We had child mental health problems on the child behavior checklist, for those of you guys who love measure details. And we looked at this measure of childhood trauma exposure and stressful life events, and we found that indeed, mom's history of trauma exposure in her own childhood predicted children's mental health, but also her pregnancy stress above and beyond in the same statistical model also uniquely predicted, suggesting that there are 2 different exposures that are important, and they aren't just operating as one. And we looked at, well, is it a clinical level of problems that it's predicting, or just kind of a little bit of a wiggle on that outcome? And indeed, we found that for each 1 increase in trauma exposure for mom's childhood, there was a 41% higher chance of clinical levels of problems in her offspring at age 4 to 6. Similarly, for each 1 type of pregnancy stressor increase, there was a 36% higher chance of clinical problems. And what I was really interested in is that history of adversity like exacerbating the impact of the pregnancy stress? And this graph says yes. So in the upper left orange, you see moms who had no childhood trauma on those 3 items, at least they might have had other things, but nothing on the 3 items we asked them about. The slope between pregnancy stress and children's mental health is pretty flat, and it's not significant. But on the lower right, you see that slope kept increasing for each increased number of childhood traumas. So moms who had 3 or more, or all 3 of the childhood traumas, there was a stronger association between stress in their pregnancy and their offspring mental health, suggesting that it exacerbated or potentiated the risk factors for those women. And we followed up at age 9. Well, is this enduring? Is it beyond age 4 to 6? We followed up at age 9, and we found indeed the associations of mom's childhood trauma went away, but pregnancy stressful life events still predicted. And it still predicted both self-reported anxiety and depression, and in particular, clinical levels of problems for anxiety. And we haven't published this yet. It just was accepted, but it's not out. But I just wanted to share with you, we just completed a study through age 18. And what we found, looking at 34 sites in ECHO, different sample sizes depending on who has which data, but maternal adversity was more likely to be linked to clinical problems in a linear gradient fashion, as you see here, with greater mental health problems for each additional ACE. When we looked at perceived stress in pregnancy for moms, also linked to problems, and that ACEs and maternal pregnancy stress also in this large sample. And the reason I'm sharing this one is because this is all the way through age 18. And what was remarkable is it didn't matter how old the kid was. When we split the sample by those under 12 and those 12 to 18, the effects were still there, suggesting that this is something to pay attention to across the life course of these kids. It doesn't just go away as they get older. We found links to airway health, to weight trajectories, so it's not just mental health too. We need to get other stakeholders at the table with us because there's stigma against mental health. People are less motivated sometimes to invest in prevention of mental health because they do a lot of victim blaming. But if you start showing that these adversities are linked to asthma risk and albuterol use and hospitalization and obesity risks, people start paying attention. So we can collect and gather together with our colleagues in medicine to get our needs met as a community. I'll just show you, this is a weight trajectory chart from age 1 to 8. We followed a bunch of kids in Memphis in a study that I've been a part of for 12 years. And we saw that when we looked at kids' growth over time, they usually fell into one of 3 categories, kind of a low, stable, moderate, stable, or a high and increasing obesity risk over early childhood, intimate partner violence exposure in pregnancy, neighborhood crime exposure in pregnancy, uniquely predicted risk of being in that high BMI trajectory with a bunch of covariates and confounders in the model. And so a quick recap. I'm rushing through this not with the goal of you remembering any particular finding, but with the intention of you seeing this pattern, that there's intergenerational transmission. We're seeing it in the placental transcriptome, and it's a likely mechanism for some of these effects. We're seeing it in different cardiovascular responses, weight gain, behavioral difficulties, physical illness, early childhood, mental and behavioral and physical health outcomes, and middle childhood as well. And pregnant people experience a lot before they become pregnant that they're carrying forward in their bodies, and indeed we're seeing evidence for those experiences predicting a range of perinatal health outcomes for moms and kids and a range of outcomes across childhood. So again, I told you a lot of bad news at the beginning. What can we do about this? Well, we're all here doing something. You guys are amazing. This is part of the solution, is having this conversation, recognizing, and figuring out what we're going to do about it. But we also have to examine factors that promote resilience, right? Thankfully, a lot of the studies I've been a part of do capture some of that. And we know that things such as caregiver knowledge of child development and sensitive parenting can be really important buffers of these associations and really protective. Just to give you a sense of this, on the left, this is the association between poverty risk and children's socio-emotional behavior problems. Red is for caregivers who were low in knowledge of typical development, didn't really understand developmental milestones. And there's a strong association between poverty stress and children's mental health. But for moms who had just one standard deviation above average, so a little better than average knowledge of child developmental milestones and typical behaviors, and there was no association. So totally broke. Just basic understanding of child development and developmentally appropriate expectations for their kids was a great buffer. Similarly, stressful life events in pregnancy and externalizing problems or disruptive behavior problems at age 5, strong association, but not for just slightly better than average caregivers when we watched their parenting and coded their behaviors and saw who was more responsive and able to be consistent. They didn't have to be perfect, just a little bit more responsive, a little bit more consistent. Similarly, neighborhood, it's not just all on those caregivers. We have a strong association between family SES and children's cortisol, that stress-related hormone I told you about in childhood. But for neighborhoods that had high quality opportunity and resources, there's no association between family, poverty, and children's cortisol. Similarly for physical health, strong association between family SES and children's physical health problems in kindergarten totally goes away in a neighborhood with high opportunity and resource. And so there's lots of factors that can totally break this connection. But as a clinical psychologist and interventionist, I wanted to know, what about direct intervention? What can we do directly to affect this? And so I partnered with these incredible people doing a mindfulness-based stress reduction pregnancy intervention called MAMAS. Our goal was to test the effect of this mindfulness-based stress reduction wellness promotion group on stress, depression, and eating behaviors. And we enrolled 215 pregnant people. They were all overweight or obese. Some people might say, oh, that's an unusual sample. It's actually about 75% of childbearing aged women in America meet this criteria, so it's actually a very representative sample of pregnant people. Predominantly low income and predominantly families of color. And I did a quasi-random assignment to intervention. We had 8 weekly sessions, 2 hours each, groups in person. This is back when people showed up to in-person interventions and groups before the pandemic. And we did a range of mindfulness activities, nutrition didactics, mindful eating discussions, and our goal was really to help these families who were ready to bring a new person in the world recognize their own stress, be able to identify when they were feeling stressed, identify their instincts, urges, and impulses to cope with that stress in healthy or unhealthy ways, and help bring their attention to a range of skills and approaches that might be more useful, might be better for themselves and their babies. And so I just want to stop for a moment here. Think about your pregnant person You're about to have a baby, you're low income, you have a lot of stress in your life, you have a very high number of adversities in your childhood, in your pregnancy, and you're perhaps working a high-stress job, you maybe have other children, there's a lot going on in your neighborhood that is not healthy. You just imagine what it's like to be in their bodies, right? And so the goal of the intervention was to help them recognize and manage some of that physiology. So what did we find from this intervention study? Well, we found that the intervention reduced stress. It increased mindfulness, improved acceptance of negative emotions, emotion regulation. It reduced depression and stress, increased physical activity, improved glucose tolerance, which is really important, especially in pregnancy. It didn't affect weight gain, which is kind of disappointing, but we did a great job in those other domains, and we're really pleased. This is a picture of that initial reduction in depression. The black line is the intervention group, and the light gray is the control group. And what you see is there was a significant and impressive decrease in depression during pregnancy after the intervention 8-week groups. I followed those babies for 8 years. And what blew our minds, I did not expect this, that reduction in depression was maintained for 8 years. From one psychosocial group intervention for 8 weeks. And what's profound is you see this blip at the end, that's COVID. Remember how everyone got more depressed? What was amazing is I didn't truly trust the impact of this intervention and its long-standing reduction on depression until I saw these data, because everyone went up, but they maintained that clinically significant difference in depression even 8 years later. So that was really profound, and we were so thrilled to find this and to know that that had made a difference in that way. But of course, I was motivated to know whether there was a 2-generation benefit. This is a picture of one of the groups. They got back together for a reunion after their babies were born, and they gave us permission to share this photo in educational context. They are amazing humans. They put up with me a lot when I was doing a lot of experiments with them. We had them sit with their babies and do things that we know are stressors and then help them recover and study that stress physiology I told you about earlier. And remember that fight or flight response system, the pre-ejection period, all of those things are related to all of our organ and system functioning. And what we found is that babies born to moms who had participated in the intervention had much healthier cardiovascular responses to stressors. They had faster sympathetic reactivity, that fight or flight response, when they needed to respond to the stress, and they were able to fully recover, and they recovered quickly. Whereas children in the treatment as usual group, they had a delayed negative response and they didn't recover. So kind of a mismatch between what was necessary and healthy to cope with the stress. And we coded second-by-second behavior of the babies, and we found they were more likely to have positive self-regulatory coping behavior during the stressor and less negative behavior. And if anyone's ever taken care of a baby, it's way easier to parent a baby that is less negative and able to do self-regulatory and soothing behaviors. And so we were thrilled to see this 2-generation benefit. We also just recently finished analyzing the data and found that it's predicting differences in age 6 mental health in the kids. So not just physiology that first year of life, but differences in mental health, internalizing and externalizing symptoms at age 6 in these kids. And it appears to be operating through both differences in depression and pregnancy, as well as differences postpartum in depression related to the intervention. And so we're very excited to see this multiple systems, multiple outcomes, longitudinal evidence of the psychosocial pregnancy intervention. And if you learn nothing else today, just please know that these little micro moments, and granted it was 8 weeks, but that's a small amount of therapy in the broader context of having this kind of long-standing impact on children and their families. This is a review, thank you. This is a review I wrote about a year ago on all the prenatal programming stress research that I could find at the time that really talks about this literature. It mentions the intervention too, the good and the bad parts we've highlighted. So if you're really interested in a deeper dive, I suggest you read this. But what about some of us, have already been born. Some of us already had our babies. Is it too late? What can we do? There's more. I had the incredible gift of partnering with the amazing Alicia Lieberman. Is anyone familiar with child parent psychotherapy? for my people, yeah. It's an incredible intervention. It's therapy for young children, birth through age 5, and their caregivers. And it supports family strengths, it respects families' cultural values, it's really trauma-focused. And there's been 5 different randomized controlled trials that have shown it's really effective at improving mental health outcomes, caregiver symptoms, and functioning in the family. So it's a really powerful intervention. And I had the gift of partnering with Alicia and her team to understand whether or not it would slow biological harm related to trauma. So this is Alicia and her team. And we had 45 families that were 2 to 6 years old, predominantly Latino cohort that completed child-parent psychotherapy. And I paired them with my seed community sample of very similar demographic families, much larger, who are age 3 to 6 years old. And we used them as a comparison group. And that's because if you have a child exposed to trauma, you don't randomize them to therapy, you get them therapy. And so instead, I used my community-based sample. They had the same measures. Both of them were my studies, so I had happened to put all the same measures in them. And we created a community comparison group. And then I partnered with my colleague up in British Columbia, Mike Kober in his lab, to really look at the buccal swabs before and after intervention that we assayed for DNA methylation. And we had a quasi-experimental design where we used very fancy statistics to make my community sample weighted and matched so that they were a really good, equally matched comparison group to the intervention group. And we calculated something called epigenetic age acceleration, which I'll tell you about here. So there is, the epigenetic clock is a summary score of DNA methylation levels at specific sites in the epigenome that are reliably associated with chronological age. So it's pretty correlated. Your epigenetic age is pretty correlated with your chronological age. And you can estimate that relative to their chronological age and see whether or not it might be accelerated. So they should be pretty well correlated, but for some people, our body and our biological age is much older than our chronological age, and for some people, it's the opposite, right? And what we find is that for people who are epigenetically old or have that accelerated biological aging relative to what you would expect them to see, that's really predicted by adversity exposure. So people who have histories of adversity, especially in childhood, they're much more likely to have an accelerated aging. And that accelerated aging is in kind associated with a whole bunch of mental and physical health outcomes later. And so this epigenetic clock and whether or not someone's accelerated is a really important marker that can tell us a lot. So we looked at this comparison group and this intervention group, and at baseline they were matched in their epigenetic clock, and whether or not that aging was accelerated. You see about half of the kids in the sample had accelerated biological aging, about half didn't, so that's kind of a normal distribution. But after the intervention, what you see is that the community sample that had been exposed to a lot of trauma was showing additional accelerated biological aging over time, which is what you expect in a sample of children who have been exposed to a lot of adversity. But the intervention sample didn't accelerate their aging. And so the intervention appears to buffer trauma-exposed children from the biological embedding of trauma by kind of slowing down or stopping that pediatric epigenetic age acceleration, at least in the short term. And we completed a review 2 years ago of science like this. Prior to our study, most of them didn't have quasi-experimental design, they were more observational. But in general, there's a good amount of evidence accumulating to suggest that this is something we should be paying attention to. There are dyadic interventions, caregiver-child interventions that have powerful effects on biology. And in particular, when we did this review, we found there's evidence for improved cardiovascular function, advanced brain maturation, decreased inflammation, and differences in intracellular processes such as epigenetic age, telomere shortening, and those kinds of things. Which is great and interesting, except it puts so much pressure on the caregivers. And in particular, in our field, there's so much mother blame, and in society, there's so much mother blame. And so I want to stop and just make sure it's super clear. I study women because they are typically the pregnant ones, and it helps me understand prenatal programming, but it's not their fault that these things are happening. And we can't hold them accountable for these outcomes, and we can't put it on them to figure out what to do so that they're not stressed, so that their kids are well. And there's whole papers about that for those who are interested. We really have to avoid the mother blame in this field, and it's an important part of the dynamic to address it. What about fathers? There's way less evidence, and yet the evidence that's emerging suggests, yeah, their mental health and stress matters too. And in fact, a recent review and meta-analysis showed that fathers' perinatal mental health was predicting offspring global, socio-emotional, cognitive, language, and physical development. Although the data doesn't extend into offspring adolescence yet, because these studies are so new and they're following the families, and they're only like 10-year-old studies. So it's coming. You matter too, dads. And of course you do. I'm being a little facetious, but what about childcare providers? I don't know about you, but my kids spent a lot of time in childcare, and sometimes I felt like they spent more time with their childcare providers. Their mental health matters too. And the level of stress of mental health and childcare providers impacts the well-being of children in their care. It's reduced quality of care, possibly, not always, can lead to less responsive communication, reduced opportunities for developmental stimulation, fewer positive interactions, and that can lead to all sorts of challenges. And there's community resources that have been identified. I'd like to highlight this new one I just found recently from 2025, a systematic review of research on protective community resources for children and youth, really pointing to it's not just the caregivers or the child care workers, but there's family networks, advisors, mentors, educational. Here's my school people in here, right? Schools, oh my gosh, my kids spend so much time in school. Recreational areas, health and wellness centers, jobs, workplaces, essential services, community connections, all of these things play really pivotal roles. They're less well studied, and especially less well with biology in the manner that I've shared with you today. But we're starting to get there. I'm on some projects that are trying to do a better job at this. And these things matter. And so social experience happens in these ecological systems. These communities are made up of individuals. But they're exposed to much more stress as a function of a variety of these systems, and we have to consider the context that they're in. And if we're trying to understand intergenerational transmission, we really have to consider all these layers, and in particular, the intersectionality. So if a person is stressed, what are all the sources of that stress if we're trying to identify how stressed they might be and how we might support them? Depending on where they are in terms of this power dynamic in our society, whether or not they're in a dominant religion or not, whether or not they are a particular marginalized community, whether or not they're transgender, whether or not they are a political alignment that matches the community they live in. And so these are huge things to think about. And how many generations do we have to consider? 400 years of enslavement of those taken from Africa? 500 years of colonialism in the Americas? Political genocide, war? It's been going on for a long time, and some people have had a lot more than others. And so we need to really understand this when we have clients in our offices, in our schools, in our communities, and really, really look at these people in the context of their history. And we've only just begun to unpack these sources. So what? I'm almost done. What can we do with this evidence? Well, we're doing some of it here today, right? You guys come here together, this family and the volunteer board who support this work are doing something about it. You're communicating, you're motivated to change the field and provide opportunities. We know that we can prevent a lot of this stuff. I love to highlight Futures Without Violence as one of my favorite organizations. We can prevent violence against women and children. We can create positive pathways for men and boys. We can improve quality health access. This is just one example. We know that if someone's had adversity from childhood, there's many things, home visiting programs, social support for parents, funding to lift people out of poverty, high quality childcare that makes a really big impact. Nadine Burke-Harris, our first California Surgeon General, was remarkable at getting ACEs on the map. Part of the reason everybody raised their hand earlier is her work. Very powerful at really making sure we're aware of this and that we do something about it as a state, and she's taken her stuff more national now. Because there's this ACEs Aware website that's very, very useful for those of you guys who are not familiar. It has incredible range of information in it. It tells you about stress busters we can all apply to our lives. These are evidence-based things that can help reduce our own individual stress, that of our clients and friends and families, and it's very powerful. I just showed you data that mindfulness in pregnancy can improve the biology of the offspring. Imagine what it'll do for the person receiving it. There's a really great Instagram account if you want to follow this, and that's your mechanism of information gathering. There's a really lovely Live Beyond California Instagram account that is a campaign in California to support healing from the impacts of ACEs, and it gives great little tidbits in small bites for folks who want to take that on. We need to disseminate. I'm here doing my job. Now your job after this is to go tell everyone you know and your stakeholders and your policymakers about how important this work is. Because if there's 450 million people struggling with mental illness, making it the leading cause of disability worldwide, and childhood onset is one of the most powerful predictors of later, why aren't people talking about the intergenerational contributions and what predicts this? We need to change our frameworks. We need to change our treatment models to consider this. Some of you guys are already doing it. I want to give you credit. And we also need to partner across physical and mental health disease spaces. California does a great job in so many areas, or especially in that prenatal to 3 policy implications, really targeting some of this. We have incredible programs in most of the domains where I have a little California state thing. We have work to do in other areas, but we have income supplementation programs, the ACEs Aware program, lots of really good programs here that we need to continue to vote to sustain. We need to help mental health and childcare for both the caregivers and the childcare providers. It's really powerful. There's billing and payment structures that California's done a great job at implementing that are really important to fund us for screening for ACEs, but also screening for depression, social drivers of health, and family strengths. And one thing, if you remember nothing else from my talk today, I just want to highlight that in California, a diagnosis is not required to qualify for dyadic care. So if you have Medi-Cal or California Medicaid, and you have a child who's 21 or under, or you're a caregiver or a provider for someone 21 and under, the parent or caregiver does not need to be enrolled in Medi-Cal, but they can receive mental health support as long as it's in the benefit of the child. Fully covered. And nobody needs a diagnosis. You just need to say, I've been exposed to some adversity and I'm concerned about my health. That's powerful. And most people don't even know about this. It's a new policy. Dyadic services can be screening, behavioral health, well-child visits, family training, counseling, parent-caregiver screenings, care coordination, referrals for further treatment. And qualified providers are across a range of provider classes, and they're trying to expand it. So in closing, hardships are often something that prepares ordinary people for extraordinary destiny. And I think the Casiano family is an incredible example of their family's legacy, of taking something that can be really challenging and making something really beautiful and impactful and powerful from it. And I like to think of everyone in this room as already knowing this because you're in the work with me. And so I ask you to help me spread the word and think about what you'll do after today to make sure that the stakeholders who are pulling the levers that fund this stuff, the prevention, the intervention, the access, are aware of these things and start really thinking about how we're going to prevent earlier, save social and economic costs for everyone, and improve the well-being of our society through these understandings. And so if you're interested in this, I have a website that breaks some of this stuff down into bite-sized pieces. You can click on the research, click a topic on the side. It'll show you all the little layperson summaries of the kind of things I talked about. But the review papers I showed you today are actually better. I have a huge team that helps me do this work. I do not do it alone. This is just some of them at UCSF alone. I have an incredible group of funders who have supported me to date, always welcoming more because there's a lot of work to be done. But I work all over the country and internationally, and this is just one team that I work with who's incredible, who did the Echo Pathways stuff I was telling you about. And I just, from them and me, I thank you for your attention and for caring about this work.